And finally, that brings me to the last way Walter outlines it. And he says that whites almost always display a minimization of racism in society. So this is that one white friend you have who somehow just doesn't get racism at all. He just says racism, that was a 60s thing. You know, we don't lynch black people anymore, which we'll get into. We have a different way of lynching them now. But we just don't lynch black people anymore. We don't have the same discrimination. There's no legal code that says black people can't do this. I mean, that's a fair point. There is no legal code that black people can't do this in most cases, but it ignores how these structures have been, again, implemented to degrade black people and put them in a second-class position. This is why that you have the generational effect of Jim Crow and slavery on families. Even if somehow we're completely to get rid of all the institutional structures that are limiting black people, it would still require successive generations of repeatedly doing the right thing to generate a black class that is on the same level with the white class right now. The other critical part of this minimization of racism is that they'll often downplay racial leaders of the class. And this is the sort of infamous thing about white people when they say, you know, MLK, he wasn't really for like that affirmative action stuff. You know, he always said it's the content of your character, not the color of your skin. No, that's not what he said at all. When whites interpret racial leaders of the past, they always put them in a colorblind context. They ignore the entire speech of what they're saying. They only take the parts about what makes them feel good, what makes them feel not as responsible for blacks' position in society. When actually, in MLK, he said that Negroes, they weren't a full race yet. We still had a lot of work to do, and a lot of that work was going to be dependent on white people actually taking responsibility and implementing structural changes that's going to benefit blacks. Now, you might think that, okay, I get it. It's on an ideological level. But is there any ways in that this ideology sort of plays out in a structural level? Can you give me like an example? I can. Can you put up clip number 2? So, one of the ways that colorblind racism manifests itself is through the mortgage lending crisis, or not the crisis, but the mortgage lending throughout history. So poor blacks tend to stay within the same neighborhood of the parents more so than whites. It's about a ratio of 72% black people staying in the same neighborhood, around 40% of the whites staying in the same neighborhood. Why is that? I think one good reason why is that the mortgage lending operates in a colorblind way. Now, if you take a look at the graph, you can see that it's around, the blacks have 27.4% denial rate, which is significantly higher than yellow races. And even if you account for things like bad credit, bad debt to income ratio, and things that white people generally are denied for, it still doesn't really, if you take the colorblind approach, it doesn't really account for the massive differences and the significant differences between whites and blacks in denial rates. So I researched a case study done by the Kentucky Human Rights, and they found this, that when black and white testers with equal characteristics requested conventional mortgages for the same housing from 10 lending institutional mortgages, blacks were given less information, less encouragement to how to return and apply for a loan, fewer helpful hints as to how to successfully attain a loan, and less encouragement that they would qualify for a loan despite an equal profile for the whites. So even if you have bad credit, they're not going to give you the same advice that they would give a white person because they already assume that you don't know how to correctly build and maintain a household because of that cultural racism part that we discussed earlier. They already assume that you're just going to fail anyway, so they won't even give you the same advice that they would like their cousin Tim, who has a trailer park and, you know, he's bad credit, but they still think Tim can pull out in the end. They trust in Tim. They don't trust in you. They don't trust in you at all. But most importantly, and this is the real kicker and why I think colorblind racism operates in a more dangerous way than in the past, is that all but one black respondent knew that they were being discriminated against. So this is how colorblind racism becomes more dangerous because you don't know when it's happening unless you educate yourself and know what the signs are. So that's why it's harder to legislate against this kind of colorblind racism and the new racism that we're experiencing in the past. You know, it's easier to tell white people to stop bringing shotguns to the polls than it is to say, hey, maybe you should give black people better advice that's relate to the current situation. And you can even see the same thing during like the 90s increase of black house ownerships. Sure, we got their mortgages, but during that time, we had subprime lending, which is the major reason why when the housing foreclosure crisis happened in 2008, that blacks were hit much harder than the white community. when the colorblind racists tell you that something is happening, you shouldn't believe them. You should always, 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 always look for a deeper level, look for a racial motive, look for something that's happening that the white people aren't really telling you about. This is a statistic from Pew Research, and Eduardo conducted this research too on the students he surveyed throughout their universities. And he found that 64.3% of whites agreed that we should expand services to benefit the poor. But only around 40% of them agreed with the proposition that the government should make every effort to improve the social and economic position of blacks. That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not sure about you guys, but if you say that black people are poor, premise one, and you say that premise two, we should do everything to help the poor, but somehow in the conclusion, you jump to the idea that we shouldn't help out blacks, even though in premise 1 and 2, you agree that you should help out poor black people, it doesn't seem to make any sense. And that's sort of the problem I have with general socialist discourse, is that they always seem to assume the idea that when we're talking about poor people, we're talking about poor whites, like my cousin Tim, he lives in a trailer. Poor Tim. I don't have anything against him, but I think we need to expand when we're talking about the poor and the poor class. We need to expand it to include black people, which has been predominantly the poor class for much longer than white people who have sort of lived in luxury during the coal mining ages, or are just now experiencing sort of resurgence in the lower class. And that's sort of what colorblind racism does too. It sort of obstructs your view of classes in general. You sort of see middle class people as like mostly white people, maybe a few good black people in there too. You see the lower classes as just purely downtrodden and exploited white people. And actually it's just that the downtrodden and exploited are mostly black people. The whites, sure, they've been exploited a little bit, but it's nowhere near the same level as the blacks.
And they're not exploited because they're white.
Yeah, exactly. It's not because of their racial components. It's because of other things. But when you're black and poor, it's almost entirely because of your racial component. Now, one good counterexample to what I've been talking about is that there's actual races out there. Can you put up clip number 5? Yeah, there's the alt-right. You've got Richard Spencer. What about those people? What about the actual racists? I may be colorblind, but those people are actually racist. I would say there's not really a difference between your colorblindness and what Richard Spencer is. I mean, even if you were to think about it on just like a purely goal-based level, what do colorblind racists actually want? What do white people actually want? We can look at their actions. They choose predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly white schools, take a predominantly white route to education. I don't know, that doesn't seem that much different from Richard Spencer wanting the white ethno-state. I mean, if you live in a primarily white society and you're not doing anything to change it, you're kind of already in the ethno-state. It's just not official. You just don't have the swastika yet.